Hello, this is Tom Repass of Canyon Rim Honeybees and Apiflora Mead in the beautiful Black Hills of western South Dakota. This presentation, Malolactic Fermentation, the other fermentation, I first presented at the American Mead Makers Virtual Conference in March 2020. Malolactic fermentation is not as commonly used in mead as it is in wine or in cider. But there certainly is a place for it in certain types of meads and styles of mead. In the words of the great Emile Pinaud, all great wines undergo two fermentations, first one by yeast, and then one by bacteria. So what is malolactic fermentation? For one, I'm not going to be discussing wild bacterial and yeast fermentation. That's a different discussion altogether. I'm talking about malolactic fermentation by certain types of bacteria that are used for the intention of lowering malic acid and decreasing perception of tartness in wine and mead, as well as offering some other beneficial effects. I'll also talk about some of the potential unwanted effects of malolactic fermentation as well, how to optimize such fermentation, also how to prevent it in meads and wines where you may not be as interested in having the effects, and then how to monitor. What is malolactic fermentation? For centuries, winemakers observed a, quote, secondary, unquote, fermentation, which occurred spontaneously, often with the arrival of warm temperatures the following spring after harvest. A wine that was clear and stable becomes cloudy, with some CO2 being released, and this was called a second fermentation. Now, I just want to make a comment here. I see a lot of home mead makers and also home wine makers talking about racking into secondary fermentation or something similar to that. What they're doing is not a second fermentation, such as a malolactic fermentation. They're simply racking the mead from the primary fermentation vessel into a second fermentation vessel, but it's still the same alcoholic fermentation that was going on in the first place. So it's not really a second fermentation. It's simply racking over into a secondary vessel from the primary. So that's not what they're talking about most of the time, unless they happen to be doing a malolactic fermentation. Prior to the mid-1900s, bacterial activity in wine was undesirable. In 1837, German enologist Freiherr von Babo recommended racking and sulfiting to address the turbidity from this, quote, second fermentation, unquote. You think about it, wine and also mead would like to become vinegar if it's left alone, and that's why we do racking, topping up, sulfiting to prevent that from happening. In 1866, Louis Pasteur isolated the first bacteria from wine, and he suggested that all bacteria in wine were spoilage organisms. They did not know the difference between some of the beneficial malolactic bacteria versus acetobacter, the acetic acid bacteria that mix wine into vinegar. But in 1891, Hermann Müller-Thurgau proposed that the acid reduction that occurs in wine was due to bacterial activity. Then, starting in the 1930s and beyond, Jean-Louis Paru-Gaillan wrote articles about the benefits of these bacteria, and then Emile Pinaud further promoted malolactic fermentation in the latter 20th century. Previously, MLF would only occur through wild bacteria, but now, more recently, commercial cultures of these bacteria are available since the 1980s. So what is malolactic fermentation? Several species of lactic acid-forming bacteria metabolize sugars, acids, and other compounds. Despite its name, it's not technically a fermentation at all, as little energy is produced. Rather, MLF is a decarboxylation of malic acid into the less sour-tasting lactic acid, with lowering of the total acidity and an increase in the pH. Other acids and products can be metabolized, including citric acid, which can be metabolized into diacetyl. That's the compound that gives the buttery notes to a barrel-aged Chardonnay. But there can also be potential negatives. volatile acidity, biogenic amines, geranium taint if it occurs in the presence of sorbate, and other off flavors. Looking at the chemistry of this, as you can see, malic acid can be converted into lactic acid, or diacetyl can be produced, or unfortunately, acetic acid as well. It can be useful in fruit-based styles, including pyments, cysers, certain highly acidic melomels. It can lower acidity by as much as 1 to 3 grams per liter of titratable acidity, and increase pH by as much as 0.1 to 0.3 units. Now we need to keep in mind that malic acid exists as two stereoisomers, D-malic acid and L-malic acid. But only the levomalic acid, exists in nature, and they cannot metabolize the D-malic acid. Now, malic acid produced commercially as an acid addition or part of an acid blend is usually a racemic mixture of both. And that's why it's not advised to lower the acidity from a previous acid addition. I'm not saying that it wouldn't do anything or that you shouldn't do it, but there's probably better ways to lower the acidity of an acid addition if you accidentally added too much malic acid to your batch. Here's a chart of the malic acid levels of various fruits. We know that apple is primarily malic acid, so if you have a apple cider or a cyser that's a little bit too acidic, using a malolactic fermentation may be helpful in that. I find it interesting that other fruits are primarily malic acid as well, such as cherry and apricot. We wouldn't really think about doing a malic acid fermentation to apricot because it's not all that acidic, even despite having primarily its predominant acid being malic acid. A grape, especially certain types of grapes or grapes grown under certain conditions, can have high malic acid. But other fruits only have minimal amounts of malic acid, and they might not be ideal for using MLF. Certain environmental or other factors can affect malic acid levels. Water stress is one of them. In drought situations or in apples or grapes that are not irrigated, there can be a higher amount of acidity, including malic acid. Potassium can increase it, while nitrogen can either increase or decrease. And then cooler temperatures are well known to increase acidity. We know that grapes that are grown in northern or cold climates tend to be high acid. You can manage that in other ways. You can balance that with, for example, stabilizing and then back sweetening. But if you would like to make a pyment or a wine that is not quite as tart or acidic without having to do back sweetening, malolactic fermentation is one of the ways that can help manage that. There are other ways to reduce malic acid other than malolactic fermentation by bacteria. There are certain strains of yeast that are known to lower malic acid by metabolizing it into ethanol. It's not technically malolactic fermentation, it's simply metabolizing the malic acid into ethanol. Probably the most well-known is 7,1-B1122, but there are others, including the lalvulin C, which can actually lower malic acid by as much as 45%. And then some of the non-Saccharomyces species of yeast can metabolize malic acid, but they're not readily available commercially, such as Schizosaccharomyces pombe. There are a number of species of malolactic bacteria. Enococcus, formerly known as leuconostoc, is a heterofermentative cocci, occurs in pairs or chains. Lactobacillus, many of us are quite familiar with that. It's used not only in wine or mead, but also in other situations such as sourdough and cheese and yogurt. These can be either homofermentative or heterofermentative rods. And then finally, Pediococcus, which is a homofermentative cocci. Now, what am I talking about when I talk about homo versus heterofermentative? Homofermentative bacteria produce lactic acid and carbon dioxide. In contrast, heterofermentative produce lactic acid, carbon dioxide, and then other compounds, such as diacetyl, for example. Here's a list of the various species of malolactic bacteria. and which are hetero versus homo fermentative. And why would this matter? Well, perhaps you only want to lower the malic acid without anything else, without diacetyl or anything else. You might choose a bacterial culture that is primarily homo fermentative. In contrast, if you want to add some complexity with some other compounds, then perhaps having some heterofermentative strains may be useful. This slide shows the progression of malolactic fermentation, keeping in mind that sometimes it can occur early, and then other times, depending on the genus, can occur late. And also seeing some of the unwanted bacteria, such as Acetobacter, increasing activity later on after alcohol has been formed from yeast fermentation, and as the conditions become more favorable to Acetobacter when there's increased oxidation, oxygen levels in the wine and mead. Just another slide showing the same thing. The malic acid level decrease while lactic acid increases. But unfortunately, especially if there's not any prevention of oxidation, you can have increasing levels of acetate. So why bother to use malolactic fermentation at all? Like I said, this is not something that's commonly done in mead. It's something that's more of a specialized technique, but it can be useful in certain situations. If you have mead styles that are higher in acidity and you would like to lower that without having to try to do other techniques, it can lower the acidity and raise the pH to make them softer and less tart and sour. It can also help with microbial stability, reduce the chances for unwanted microbial activity, unwanted wild bacteria, or after it's bottled. There can possibly be beneficial changes in aroma and flavor, but it's important to consider that the effects can be either positive or negative depending on what you're trying to accomplish. So, what are the effects of malolactic fermentation? Potential positives: reduce acidity in a mead or a wine that is overly acidic. Diacetyl, that's that buttery, butterscotch, nutty type of flavor that we see sometimes. It can also improve flavor and complexity by reducing vegetative notes, rounding out the mouthfeel, and lowering the astringency and bitterness. Although it does not directly affect tannins, the higher the acid in a mead that already has tannins, it can make the perception of tannins seem more so as compared to if there's lower acidity that can increase the flavor and taste of the tannins. And then, potential negatives: increased volatile acidity, that is acetic acid. Diacetyl can be pleasant in small amounts, but excessive amounts of diacetyl can overwhelm everything. There can be a color change. The color, especially the anthocyanins, are pH dependent, and if the pH raises too much, you can go from that brilliant ruby purple color to something that is more rust in color, which may not be so present. And then you have compounds such as ethyl carbamate, biogenic amines that are unwanted. We'll talk about that more in a bit. If you decided to stabilize with sorbate first and then do a malolactic fermentation, you can get what we call geranium taint, and there can be some other undesirable flavors and aromas. So the primary reason that many of us use MLF is for acid reduction. In styles that have high acidity, excessive tartness from malic acid, this can lower the acidity from the malic acid by converting it into the less sour tasting lactic acid and a little bit of CO2. Lactic acid tastes less sour than malic acid, and therefore the MLF can decrease the perception of tartness. But not all styles benefit from malic acid. If you have an excessively tart mead, but it's not from malic acid, it's from something else, say citric acid, then this might not be the best way to manage that. If you have a style in which you like that bright, crisp flavor, that high acid, fruit-forward flavor, maybe malic acid is not what you want because it'll decrease that. It'll make it seem, from crisp and tart and fruity, it'll make it seem kind of flat. And then if you have a mead that is already low acid and high in pH, this is obviously the wrong thing. You would definitely not want to do this. So what about gluconic acid? We all know that gluconic acid is the primary acid uh, within honey, but if it's converted by heterofermentative malic acid bacteria, it can be converted into acetic acid, vinegar, and then ethyl acetate as volatile acidity, which is unwanted. Thus, you might consider using more of the homofermentative malolactic cultures instead of heterofermentative. That's not to say you should not do that or cannot do that, but it's something just to be aware of when using this in a mead. This is a little bit more of a busy slide, but it's to show you that malolactic fermentation is much more than just reduction of the malic acid into lactic acid. There's a whole bunch of other compounds that can be produced, some of which are good things and some of which are maybe not so good. So diacetyl can also be produced from citric acid. In not excessive amounts, it can impart buttery, nutty, butterscotch, and other characteristics. Just think about a buttery Chardonnay. But if it's at a high level, it can be overpowering and kind of distract from the other flavors that may be present. The other thing to keep in mind is citric acid, besides being metabolized into diacetyl by these bacteria, can also be metabolized into acetic acid or vinegar, which is unwanted. And thus, that's why we try to avoid adding citric acid to mead that's intended for malolactic fermentation later. And this is another reason why you might not want to do this, use MLF in a fruit that is primarily citric acid. It was previously thought that if you co-inoculate the bacteria with the yeast at the time of initial pitch when you're going to do the primary alcohol fermentation, this would increase the risk of volatile acidity, but that's now being debated. Other volatile compounds can be esters, and malolactic acid can either increase or decrease the levels of certain esters. Some of these esters are listed below, and some of them can be quite pleasant and add complexity to our meads and wines. Acetaldehyde, at low levels, it gives a fruity aroma and maybe even a bit of nuttiness, but at higher levels, this is considered an oxidative flaw. We usually use sulfites to manage and prevent excess aldehyde, but too much sulfite can inhibit malolactic bacteria. And some studies actually show that malolactic bacteria can decrease the acetaldehyde, which may be another way of managing this instead of having to add sulfites. But when the malolactic bacteria metabolize the sulfite-bound acetaldehyde, this can result in a stuck or sluggish MLF. So usually when I'm planning on doing malolactic fermentation, I try not to do many sulfite additions or make sure that the levels are low prior to pitching my culture of MLF bacteria. And this is showing how you can lower acetaldehyde levels with MLF bacteria, which can allow you to use lower amounts of sulfites later, only enough for protection, rather than trying to manage the acetaldehyde. Another group of compounds that are unwanted are biogenic amines. And these are complex, and there's a large variety of them. But these biogenic amines, histamine, tyramine, and others, might be the cause of red wine headache or flushing. A lot of people say that they get a red wine headache and they blame it on the sulfites, but red wine does not have the high amounts of sulfites as compared to white wine. And of course, you could get a headache from the alcohol too if you drink too much of it. But it's possible that these biogenic amines might be the cause, and some types of MLS strains can be more likely to do it, and it's more likely with wild, spontaneous malolactic fermentation. And some other compounds, putrescine, quedurvaline, I mean, think about those names, can give some pretty negative aromas and character. This slide shows the differences between spontaneous or wild MLF versus selected strains. And that's why we tend to prefer selected cultures of malolactic bacteria rather than just letting it occur naturally. Now, you may have put MLF in a barrel, say, previously, and now you're going to rack another mead into that same barrel, and so there's a good chance that you're still going to have that same strain or group of strains in that barrel ready to perform MLF on the next batch that you put into that barrel. Ethyl carbamate. It's a carcinogen found in many fermented foods and beverages, including alcoholic beverages. It's formed by a reaction of ethanol with a precursor. Certain strains will be more likely to create ethyl carbamate as compared to others. We can lower the risk of this by choosing a selected strain of MLF bacteria, but also avoid excess nutrient additions beyond what is consumed by yeast fermentation. This is a big problem in a lot of home mead making. They often, many of us, and myself included over the years before I knew better, will add excess nutrients or add them too late in yeast fermentation so they're not consumed, and these excess nutrients are left over, present, and if malolactic bacteria begin to metabolize these, you can begin having ethyl carbamate fermentation as well. But inhibiting the MLF bacteria, such as with sulfites or lysozyme, immediately after the MLF has been completed, that can help minimize the formation of this. Another problem that can occur is geranium taint. So geranium taint is not from a compound called geraniol. It's actually from ethoxyhexa-3,5-diane, which occurs when certain types of bacteria convert sorbic acid, the potassium sorbate that we use to stabilize a sweet mead, into this compound that has geranium leaves-like aroma. Myself, I would say it's like almost rotting wet geranium leaves. Geranium is not that, as a plant, the botanical geranium is not that unpleasant, but the geranium taint that you can have occur in these meads that have sorbate is extremely unpleasant, and even small amounts are intolerable. It does not form unless less ethanol is already present, and thus you don't have to worry about it so much in the must, and you're not going to be putting sorbate in the must, obviously. You don't want to inhibit yeast fermentation, but it's much less likely with selected strains of malolactic bacteria as compared to the wild type. Nonetheless, if I'm planning on doing malolactic fermentation, I am not going to back sweeten and use potassium sorbate because I worry that it's going to restart and then cause this flaw to occur. There's a number of other off flavors that can occur, again, more likely with wild type MLF bacteria. You can get mousy off flavors, barnyard type aromas and flavors. And so in order to avoid this, it's best to use selected bacterial strains and try to practice good sanitation to avoid establishment of unwanted wild lactobacillus and pediococcus. Other potential issues, which are pretty rare, acrolein can metabolize glycerol into acrolein, which causes bitterness. You can have a ropiness, where the glucose is metabolized into glucans and other polysaccharides, resulting in oiliness or increased viscosity to the point where it just ropes or gloops out when you pour it from the bottle into the glass. Taurin is certain lactobacillus bacteria degrade tartaric acid, decreasing the acidity by 3 to 50%, resulting in very dramatic changes. This is much more likely with wild bacteria, so thus we avoid by using selected strains rather than letting wild fermentation occur. I've never actually seen any of these occur in a mead, but certainly they are possible. When we're doing malolactic fermentation, we try to optimize the conditions, the same as when we're trying to optimize yeast fermentation. So we can optimize by choosing a yeast strain that is compatible with these bacteria. Timing of inoculation, should we inoculate during alcoholic fermentation or after? Using a selected malolactic strain versus spontaneous wild bacteria. The bacteria need more than malic acid, just like our yeast need more than sugar to be healthy, so there are complex nutrients designed for these bacteria. And you need to consider whether you would like to have a high versus lower diacetyl level. You can select strains that can do either. You just need to pick what you're intending to do in your in your end product, and then you try to avoid factors that can negatively affect these bacteria. Here's a slide looking at which strains are more favorable versus less favorable to be combined with malolactic bacteria. You can see the QA23, D25471B, and the Asmanhausen are probably the most favorable, but any of these that are 3, 4, or 5 can be used. Nonetheless, if you're planning on doing MLF, I would tend to choose strains that are from the left side of this slide rather than the right side. And if you're going to be using a yeast variety that's not on this slide, I'd certainly look up from the producer whether it's positive, negative, or neutral towards malolactic fermentation. Selected cultures versus wild, spontaneous malolactic fermentation. For many years, it would occur naturally. We didn't even know what was going on until the bacteria were identified, but there are potential negatives from allowing spontaneous MLF. You don't know what type of bacteria are going to be present, and so you might get some off flavors, biogenic amines, or they may be sluggish or not fully complete the malolactic fermentation, resulting in an overall decrease in quality. Using a commercial culture, the same as we might use a commercial yeast strain rather than just wild yeast, it can minimize most of these risks. The timing of inoculation of the bacteria and the yeast has been debated over the years. It can be added at the time of yeast pitch, which is called co-inoculation, or after the yeast alcoholic fermentation has been completed, which is called sequential. The benefits of co-inoculation: more nutrients are available early on in fermentation. The yeast has not had time to use them up, so there's also more nutrients available for the bacteria. The lower ethanol levels are less likely to suppress the bacteria. You're likely to get a lower diacetyl production, although that's kind of being debated now. It may depend on the strain of bacteria. You're more likely to get a more rapid completion of the MLF, but there may be a possibility of increased volatile acidity. Again, that's being debated. Potential disadvantages: the yeast and malolactic bacteria may compete for resources. You might get a stuck yeast fermentation or even a stuck bacteria fermentation, and the heterofermentative strains might produce unwanted byproducts such as volatile acidity, i.e. acetic acid and ethyl acetate. Adding malolactic culture after yeast fermentation has been completed is more common. The benefits is that it lowers the risk of yeast and bacteria competing for resources, so there's a lower risk of yeast being stuck, a lower risk of elevated volatile acidity. Again, it may depend on the strain, and you're going to encourage higher diacetyl production. Disadvantages: there's a potential for a sluggish or stuffed bacterial fermentation due to higher SO2, lower pH, elevated ethanol, and perhaps inhibitory factors from the yeast itself or lack of nutrients. And if you wait too long, there's a potential of unwanted wild spontaneous bacterial infection. To thrive, bacteria need more than just malic acid. They need other nutrients, including essential amino acids, vitamins. They cannot use inorganic nitrogen, DAP, diammonium phosphate, unlike yeast early on in fermentation. The fine lees from the yeast may provide some nutrition, and that is why MLF fermentation often is better when you are aging the Mead sur lees on the fine lees within the barrel or within your other fermentation vessel. There are commercial nutrients available for MLF bacteria. Acta-ML is used during rehydration, and it's made from a specific blend of inactive yeasts. I try to think of this product as being analogous to GoFerm that we use for during rehydration for our yeast. And another commercial product, and there are others. Scott Labs is not the only producer. These are just put up as examples. I'm not saying that you can use other commercial products by other manufacturers, but I think of the Optimalo Plus as being analogous, say, to Fermaid K. It's used during fermentation. And this is a slide showing the use of the proper rehydration with Acta-ML. It shows that the fermentation occurs faster and sooner when it's used versus not. And this is another one showing the Optimalo Plus, showing the malolactic fermentation occurring faster and to completion as compared to the batches that did not have the nutrients added. This slide shows the difference between strains of MLF and diacetyl production. Some of these can produce higher amounts of diacetyl, whereas others, like the bottom of the slide, omega, produce very low levels. If you're wanting to increase diacetyl production, choose a strain known to be a high production of diacetyl, such as beta or PN4. Decrease contact time with the leaves, rack off the gross leaves before pitching your bacteria. Add the bacterial culture after primary yeast fermentation because yeast will degrade diacetyl. The longer the malolactic fermentation occurs, the higher the level of the diacetyl. And so lower pH, low temperature, low inoculation rates favor higher diacetyl because the fermentation will be slower. Stir during the fermentation to encourage slight oxidative conditions that also promote diacetyl. SO2, however, can cause diacetyl to seem to disappear, but over time, as sulfite decreases, the diacetyl can be released again. On the other hand, if you want a fermentation that has minimal diacetyl, then you should choose a strain that is a medium to low diacetyl producer, such as VP41 or MT01. Increase contact time with leaves and yeast. Add the malolactic culture at the same time as the yeast is added during alcoholic fermentation, remembering that yeast will degrade diacetyl. The faster that the MLF fermentation occurs, the lower the diacetyl rate, and also the higher the pH, higher the temperature, and higher rate of inoculation, also lower diacetyl levels. Encouraging reductive conditions, that is low oxygen, can also help minimize diacetyl, so avoid stirring, unnecessary racking. Maybe even ferment in a vessel, not a barrel, but say like in stainless steel or in glass, to maintain low oxygen levels. And then adding sulfites when diacetyl is right where you want it will stop the MLF. These bacteria are very sensitive to sulfites, and so once you add the sulfites, that will stop the MLF fermentation and prevent a further increase in diacetyl levels. Now, just as yeast can be stuck in fermentation, so too malolactic bacteria can become stuck. So some conditions can favor MLF bacteria, and other conditions can make it more difficult. So higher alcohol makes it more difficult. Lower alcohol is more favorable. Lower pH makes it more challenging. Higher pH makes it easier for the bacteria. Higher sulfites suppress or even prevent entirely MLF bacterial fermentation. And then warmer temperatures encourage MLF, whereas colder temperatures decrease. So we try to make the conditions as favorable as possible when we're trying to encourage MLF fermentation. Now be aware the bacteria metabolize acetaldehyde, and if you already did a sulfite addition, sulfite can be released from that acetaldehyde as the bacteria metabolize it, which can actually raise the SO2, thereby suppressing the bacteria. So you try to keep the total SO2 levels fairly low. Now sometimes you might not want malolactic fermentation. You might want to prevent it, and where are situations where it's undesirable? You don't want it to occur after bottling. I mean, you don't want any CO2 or it's not usually going to be like a bottle bomb that might happen if it's yeast that started fermenting, but it may add some a bit of a carbonation that's unwanted. If you have a crisp, high-acid, fruit-forward style, you might want to preserve that. And then I mentioned, if it's already been stabilized by sorbate, you don't want to get the geranium taint, and that's another situation where you do not want MLF bacteria to become active. So some of the ways you can prevent that from happening: perform malolactic fermentation before bottling. Once it's done and complete, you're less likely to have these bacteria become active in the bottle. These bacteria are very sensitive to sulfites. So make sure you maintain at least 0.8 milligrams per liter of molecular SO2. And as I discussed in another presentation, this is dependent upon how much acid you have, what the pH is. Low pH less than 3.2 discourages MLF. lysozyme, which is an enzyme, can prevent that. And there's other methods that really are not available to home mead makers, and probably not, I mean, sterile filtration, yes, but the other two really probably are not available to most commercial mead makers either. These would be something that would be done by a large winery. This slide shows the sensitivity of yeast and bacteria to sulfites, and it shows that 0.8 is roughly the cutoff to address many of these. So to try to inhibit MLF from occurring, try to keep the molecular SO2 at least 0.8 milligrams per liter or greater. Lysozyme is an enzyme that degrades the wall of gram-positive bacteria, and that includes the MLF bacteria, including Enococcus and Lactobacillus. It does not affect gram-negative bacteria such as Acetobacter or yeast like Brettanomyces. So that is why we always use, in combination with sulfites, to prevent these microbes from becoming active. By using lysozyme and inhibiting the MLF, you can also lower levels of histamine, biogenic amines, etc. The effects of this enzyme can last up to 6 months, but it does not last as long in red wines or pyments that and melomels that have this because of the reaction with the phenols and the tannins. So it lasts longer in white wines or in meads that do not have these phenols and tannins. You can add at the time of the press or the addition of the juice in order to delay the MLF. Maybe you would like to delay the malolactic fermentation until later. Maybe you do not want a wild or spontaneous MLF, but then after yeast fermentation is done, you would like to use your selected culture of malolactic bacteria. And so being an enzyme or a protein, you can remove this later with bentonite. So you add this initially at the time that you're performing the yeast fermentation, and then you remove it later post-alcoholic fermentation with bentonite, and then you can proceed with your selected strain, adding that to go on an MLF fermentation at that point. The dosage will affect what happens. 500 milligrams per liter will completely inhibit an unwanted MLF, whereas 250 to 300 can delay it but not completely prevent it. And this is just a slide showing what you might do. You might add the sulfites and lysozyme, right at the harvest, and if you're using fruit juice or frozen fruit, do your yeast fermentation, and it'll inhibit the early on malolactic fermentation from occurring. And then afterwards, or using bentonite to remove any lysozyme, you can inoculate with your selected strain. And then it can go on until you decide to treat it with sulfites, which at that time it is now complete. And now you can stabilize and clarify and proceed with bottling and so on. Sterile filtration can be very useful. It's not really something that's accessible to home mead makers. And you need to remember that these bacteria are very small. We usually use 0.45 microns or less in like a membrane type filter, and I talk about this in much greater detail in my presentation about filtration. The depth filtration that we normally have as home mead makers and many commercial mead makers, however, it's not absolute filtration, and that's what you need. You need absolute filtration, but it's only nominal, and so depth filtration is not going to be enough to sterile filter and prevent bacterial activity later. Instead, you're going to have to do what we call surface filtration with a membrane filter, and you have to make sure that the filter has integrity, because if there's any leaks or holes, some of these bacteria can slip through, and it doesn't take very many to cause there to be malolactic activity in the bottle. And so that's why many of us, even if we do sterile filtration, we still have a little bit of sulfite on board after sterile filtration to keep it safe. I know several commercial mead makers who did sterile filtration and then put their product in bottles or in cans, and they did not want to add a lot of sulfites. Maybe that was for marketing purposes or other reasons, and then they ended up having in bottle or in can fermentation, and they had to recall those, and obviously that's embarrassing, and it can be like a severe financial issue either if you're doing this, depending on how much product you have to recall. Vilcorin, dimethyl dicarbonate. I have not heard of any commercial mead makers using this product. It is effective in inhibiting both yeast and bacteria, but it does have very specific training in how to use. The machine is very expensive, and so it's something I perhaps there's a commercial mead maker using this somewhere, but not anyone that I have heard of or know of. I've only heard of winemakers using this product. Fumaric acid has also been used for both acidification and also to inhibit malolactic bacteria. It's has some legal limits to it. It does help stop active MLF, and cells, even though they're present, could not be grown. If the levels are not that high, then supposedly it's not detectable taste-wise. I am not aware of any commercial mead makers using this, but it is an option that has been used by winemakers. How to monitor for your malolactic fermentation. There's 4 common methods of monitoring. You can simply watch. Once the mead is no longer cloudy, there's no more CO2 being produced. It's probably been probably to completion. Obviously, this is not very sensitive, not very accurate. But it is something that many of us have done over the years. There's paper chromatography, which you compare the movement of various spots of samples to the spots where the acid standards are. I'll show more about this here in a moment. If you're going to, there's also the enzymatic method, which looks at the color change of a sample placed on a test strip. And then there's also a CO2 biopressure signal that's done on the Vinmetrical SC50 MLF analyzer. Paper chromatography, it's kind of cool. I've done it with wine and also with mead. You have small samples of wine or mead that are placed on the paper along with the acid standards, tartaric acid, malic acid, and lactic acid with a capillary tube. The paper is put into a jar with butanol formic acid solvent and a bromocresol green indicator. It's left overnight, removed, and dried. And as the solvent advances on the paper, each acid is deposited at a different point that's specific to the percent of the total distance traveled by the solvent. And by comparing the acid spot of the sample to the spots of the known acid standards, you can determine when the progress of MLF is revealed. What the heck am I talking about? Here's a little example. And so this is showing where the tartaric acid is, and the lactic acid and the malic acid would be. And so these 4 samples show that the malolactic fermentation is complete. How do I know that? There's no more spots at the level of the malic acid. This one shows that it's not started. There is no lactic acid whatsoever. You only have tartaric acid and malic acid. This one right here, it's partial. So there's some lactic acid forming, but the malic acid is still present as well. So that's a partial malolactic fermentation. There's an enzymatic method, the Acuvin malic acid quick test. You can buy a kit. It's about 10 tests, maybe $3 or $4 per test. Once the malic acid is less than 30 milligrams per liter, you know the MLF is complete. A fairly simple, straightforward test. And then the Vinmetrica SC50 MLF analyzer is another method which you can use. If you already have the Vinmetrica SC300 or SC100, this is something that you can use. The cost, $160, $180. I haven't checked. It's been a few years. Everything's gone up, so I suspect the price of it is probably a bit more now, a few years after the initial presentation was given. So I suspect the cost is actually a bit more than that, just like everything else has gone up. This might be something that the serious home mead maker might use, or a commercial meadery. There are quite a few other methods. These are very expensive. These are ones that you might send off to a commercial wine laboratory, and this might be how they might analyze it for you. They're really not something that is going to be accessible to us as home or commercial mead makers, but I did want to mention that there are other methods to evaluate formalic acid. Malolactic fermentation. Conclusion. It's commonly done in wines and ciders, but might also be useful in certain styles of mead that resemble those. So pyments, cysers, certain high acid fruit-based melomels. It can be helpful for lowering acidity and raising pH, for microbial stability. If you do a malolactic fermentation with a selected strain and ferment that to completion, the conditions are not going to be favorable to a wild malolactic fermentation occurring later on, such as when it's in the bottle. And besides lowering acidity, it can also change aroma and flavor, improve mouthfeel, and some other beneficial changes. But be aware, not all malolactic bacteria will have positive effects, especially if you're using wild, spontaneous malolactic bacteria. You might have volatile acidity, biogenic amines, or if you don't want diacetyl or you don't want too much diacetyl, that can also be problematic. So consider using selected strains for more consistent and predictable results with a lower chance of unwanted effects. And optimize your malolactic fermentation with nutrient additions and avoiding unfavorable conditions. If you're going to do a malolactic fermentation, try to keep the free SO2 less than 8 parts per million and the total less than 40. Try to perform MLF with lower alcohol levels. There are some selected strains of bacteria that can tolerate up to 16%, however. Keep the pH between 3.2 and 3.5 and the temperature relatively warm. This is not something that, again, we're going to be doing in most or even a large portion of our meads, but it can be useful in certain strains that resemble wine or cider or some of the high acid melomels. I really appreciate some of the effects that MLF have upon some of the types of mead that I have made. It's something that I hope that you all consider playing around with and experimenting with, and it would be wonderful to see some more MLF commercial meads available as well. As always, here are my references. Many of them are open access, not all. I encourage you to not take my word or anyone else's word for all of this, but make up your own mind. And that brings us to the conclusion. Thank you very much, and you all have a great day.